so as to artificially reduce supply. Wars radically reduce capital stock and so act as a reboot, enabling capital accumulation to occur again. The 1% who have the most control over this game don't seem to particularly care which mechanisms are used as long as profits continue to accrue. They aren't the ones suffering the displacement or doing the dying, so they tend to echo the character played by Peter Sellers in the war movie How I Won the War, featuring John Lennon, when he says, "What we need is a good, clean killing." As for the majority, they shouldn't, in my opinion, really worry about running out of oil or the cost of goods made from living biomass, because mass production techniques will make them ridiculously cheap over time. And that time could be drastically shortened if the masses themselves got involved with mass production by studying STEM, science, and applying their knowledge, your knowledge. A world of tinkerers could transform plants and animals and microbes and fungi into everything we need in no time. The real limits to growth, to economic growth, are the rate of growth, the rate of biological growth, which in turn is limited by the amount of sunlight and surface area. These are the true limits to growth, because in order to build up a huge reserve of fossil hydrocarbons that can be exploited rapidly to manufacture all of the things we've come to depend on, took millions of years of concentrated sunlight accumulating beneath the earth at a density that we will never see again in our lifetimes. Oil and coal and fossil fuels, said the economist E.F. Schumacher, are like our savings account. They're capital stock, which we should only tap into for investments that yield high returns. They accumulate slowly over time, and when we've amassed enough, we want to use them to invest in things like buildings, education, infrastructure. You never tap into your savings account to get a haircut or to mow the lawn, Schumacher said. On the other hand, solar energy and its biomass derivatives are like income. They trickle in slow and steady and are meant to be used for daily needs. They are our checking account, which we try to balance with our income. Society has been exploiting its collective savings account to do all sorts of silly things that should only be done with the checking account's balance. We've burned our fossil reserves to drive to a fast food restaurant, burned them up to get to work every day, depleted our stocks and drained them down to blow dry our hair, when all along we had a checking account we could have used. The fears of believers in capitalism seem to be based on an appreciation for the glacially slow rate of capital accumulation in nature, and a reliance on fossilized natural capital to drive an economy that exploits that natural capital through labor, making it fungible and available to shuttle its value between financial capital and social capital and cultural capital and intellectual capital. It is feared that when we run out of the massive pools of stored capital stored in the fixed carbon of slow-growing trees and slow-cooking oil and gas and coal deposits and accretions of radioactive isotopes, our ability to keep civilization going will fail, and our society, like a house of cards, will collapse. Such people are afraid that the rates of capital production in nature in real time cannot match our demand, and this is because sunlight, the major driver of most energy systems, is diffuse, and despite the sun rising every day with a clockwork reliability, its intensity is unpredictable and intermittent. The same is said of its derivatives, wind and water power. We somehow forget that the Earth is also blessed with a constant rotary motion that also drives wind and water and waves, along with a moon that helps create constant tides, and has a nuclear core that is always hot and always produces steam. We somehow don't talk enough about how all the sources combined add up to more energy, clean, reliable energy, than we could ever use up, and that they're more or less instantaneously available everywhere. But then, much of humanity has always known this and argued vociferously that we can base our civilization on these sources rather than on fossils. The fact that they lost the argument seems more to come down to power politics and issues of control, and often simply a lack of imagination than any real physical or technological or economical barriers. The fact of the matter is, renewable energy technologies are nothing new. A brief look at this timeline of the time-space continuum of renewable energy proves that. We can spin the globe in space and time and see how and where and who and when people have gotten their energy since civilization began. It turns out fossil fuels have been known and used, often begrudgingly, for thousands of years. The Chinese were using coal in 2000 BC and developed natural gas 2,200 years ago and refined petroleum for energy use in the 1st century. But apparently people didn't like it much. The heavy carbon chains made it filthy and smelly and poisonous, and people knew it. Most people avoided the dirty fuels. And why not? Renewable energy was also being used in ancient times, and it was cleaner and more abundant. The ancient Egyptians made shallow black pools to create solar hot water. Europeans used vertical water wheels 2 centuries before Christ, and the Islamic era Persians were also using windmills in the 10th century. Long before that, thousands of years before that, ancient Persians and Assyrians were using biogas. And it's doubtful they were the only ones, since everybody knows that you can light farts. And the process of fermentation was well known. Biogas and alcohol were just 2 of the renewable fuels that naturally existed everywhere. Marco Polo talked about biogas when he got back from China in the 13th century, and it did see some attention in Europe. Other biofuels, particularly wood, but also straw and dung, were always used by humanity, and they could also be quite dirty and toxic when burned in campfires and other inefficient combustion designs. But more efficient, cleaner ways to burn them were well known. It's not like our ancestors were stupid. What seems to have happened was a constant up and down and fits and starts in history of people inventing and implementing ways to create an almost paradise on Earth. Just think of the earliest vertical urban farming techniques in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or the peaceful and advanced Minoan and Mycenaean matriarchal cultures of ancient Crete before the volcanic eruption. And then succumbing to warfare and having all that progress and all that capital stock destroyed. Whether it was social or technological innovation, we have plenty of evidence of golden ages where humanity got it right until some event happened that put the power mongers in control. The libraries of Alexandria, for example, which recorded most of the world's progress in science and medicine, were burned by barbarians, and a dark ages ensued, ruled by feudal lords with little interest in allowing enlightenment. But it isn't all dark satanic mills after the collapse of a given golden age, and people picked themselves back up. In terms of renewable energy, of course, the Dutch were going crazy for windmills since the 1500s, and harnessing the wind and the water led to the great age of European exploration by both sailing ships and industry. By the 1700s, it gets even more interesting. The steam engine is invented in 1712, a date that is often regarded as the birthday of the Industrial Revolution. And while the steam engine was developed to most often use the carboniferous legacy of stored sunlight, otherwise known as coal, the steam engine is really only the first of what should be more properly referred to as heat engines, whose simple principle is that an expanding fluid, usually a hot gas, can be used to drive a piston which turns a shaft and spins things like wheels and electric generators. Once the principle was discovered and the first heat engines built, it was just a matter of time before people discovered a huge number of ways to heat up fluids and gases. Fossil fuels weren't necessary, and scientists and tinkerers who didn't have access to them knew it well. In fact, most people had serious concerns about the pollution caused by most fossil fuels and had no interest in working with these filthy substances. Science Photo Library documents the solar furnace developed by French chemist Antoine Lavoisier in the 1770s for use in his experiments. They say, quote, "The furnace focused the heat of the sun using lenses which had a diameter of up to 1.32 meters. The lenses were made from curved sheets of glass with the internal space filled by vinegar. This furnace was intended to replace the need for fuel in experiments that needed heat because of concerns about contamination from the fuel's combustion products. In one experiment, Lavoisier used the furnace to burn diamond in air in a glass jar. By analyzing the combustion products, he was able to show that diamond was comprised solely of carbon." End quote. The concerns about contamination from dirty fossil fuels combustion products is hardly a recent phenomenon, So let's not fool ourselves thinking that the drive for clean fuels is something that can only accompany the famous Kuznets environment curve after some kind of magical inflection point. In fact, we could have had clean development all along. It isn't as if we had to go through a couple of hundred years of filth and pollution to reach the level of civilization we had today. And almost none of the renewable energy sources we are turning toward today, albeit at a snail's pace, are really novel. The 19th century saw an explosion of commercial applications for renewable energy, and almost 100 years after the birth of the steam engine that ran on the